Almanase, producer and host of the show. With me today is Professor Kjetil Tronvoll. He is the Professor of Peace Conflict Studies at Hornes University College, and he's also Director of Oslo Analytica. I'm honored to have you, Professor, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mikael.
Okay, just at the 11th hour to the ongoing war in Tigray, which has now expanded beyond Tigray, you were very spot on the inevitability of war breaking out anytime at that time, and things proved you right. So what have been your observations since? How have the course of the war progressed or gone, in your view?
Yes, I don't think it came as any surprise to anyone, not at least the Tigrayan people, that the confrontation would come soon when I was there in September last year. So the outbreak of the war was not a surprise. I think what was a surprise was the way the war was fought by the Ethiopian, Eritrean and Amhara forces. The extreme atrocities committed, the targeting of civilians, the destructions of civilian infrastructure and property, the deliberate destruction of health facilities, wells, farming equipment, and even the looting of religious sacred material. That is, one must say, a surprise. This was a new type of war in an Ethiopian context, the way it was fought, targeting the civilian population. The overwhelming force of the Ethiopian and Eritrean combined armies pushed the Tigrayan forces back in combination with the use of drones in the initial phase of the war. What we did see then in early this year, in January this year, after the TDF had pulled out of Mekelle and the cities and regrouped in the mountains, you saw, and particularly also, significant here is the change of government in the USA, and that the new Biden administration put pressure on Emiratis to close their base in Assab, so also then pulling back the drone capacity, led to changes in how the war developed in Tigray. I think the most significant factor here is the fact that as the war was an atrocity war, maybe bordering to a genocidal war, the people of Tigray didn't have any choice than either sit still and be killed, so to say, or to join the resistance. And the thousands of youth, of men and women, flocking to the TDF to be recruited to fight for their families, to fight for their sisters and mothers and fathers, to fight for their daily life, of course, changed the dynamic of the warfare. And to be blunt, one can say that if Ethiopian government had obeyed to their own objective of the war, meaning to arrest just the top level leadership of TPLF, these couple of dozens of people, if they had left it to that and conducted a heart and mind campaign, as it is called, versus the Tigrayan people, protecting them, offering increased development assistance, full services and so on, I think we would have seen a different kind of war. I don't think we would have seen the massive recruitment, for instance. And that then the federal government would still be in control of Tigray, possibly, if that strategy would have been employed, and of course without the Eritrean engagement. But they didn't do it like that. They used the most brutal strategy, as we have seen, to try to conquer and to try to suppress and even to try to kill off the Tigrayan people. Hence that massive mobilization, combined with a very, very skilled military leadership of TDF, a strategic thinking on how to convert then from guerrilla warfare to more mobile warfare, obtaining more and more heavy equipment during the spring, and during the offensives in March, April, going back maybe also to a certain degree of conventional warfare, as the mechanized and heavy artillery was also captured. And then the final days of the Operation Alula signifies to the remarkable strategic achievements of the TDF forces. And as I've also stated, I think what we saw during the spring month of this year, where guerrilla army, as it was called, managed to push back and beat Africa's two biggest standing armies, the Eritrean forces and Ethiopian forces, in a matter of some few weeks. That's an accomplishment which will enter the curriculum of military schools across the world, I would believe.
Yeah, I was to come to that, because you posted this, that this would be a very unique subject of study, that it would go to the curriculum. So what you just mentioned two factors. One is the atrocities, and then the leadership, the strategic leadership, as bringing about the turnaround in the course of the conflict. Why do you think is this unique subject of study? I just want you to build on that.
Well, I think you have a set of sub-factors here explaining or informing our analysis of how the war was conducted and how it developed. I remember talking to Dr. Debretsion quite early on this year, in probably around February, March, and he mentioned to me that, they were receiving massive influx of new recruits. And he said, it's a surprise to us old-timers that, we were used to recruit farmers, uneducated farmers, during the 17 years of the struggle. And we needed to use a lot of time to instruct them, to teach them the mechanics of a Kalashnikov and so on and so forth, how to organize in military units before they were ready to enter the struggle. This time, he said, we are receiving university professors, medical doctors, professionals, and everyone is high school graduates. So they are ready to go immediately. They understand instructions, they understand a manual, everyone is literate, highly educated, and they understand the need of military structures and objectives. So it was so much more easy to convert the recruits into operational military units. And that, in addition to the morale, the dedication, what are you fighting for? Obviously, a guerrilla war, insurgency wars are not won because of the numbers or because of the equipment. They are basically won because of what you are fighting for. What is the objective? What is the morale, the fighting spirit with your group versus the adversaries? And I would say that the Tigrayan people and TDF, they are standing with their back against the wall as they perceive it today in Ethiopia. And they're fighting not only for their own lives, they're fighting for the lives of their children and the parents and their collective security, which makes the fighting morale, I would say, probably quite higher than the adversaries. In addition to that is the military leadership itself and the skills and professionalism of the Tigrayan military leadership. And I would say, combining the international experience and the kind of modern military thinking of General Tadesse, the head of the army, with old-timers like General Zadgan and others, has proven to be a very good and fruitful combination of how to design the strategy in, first of all, regaining control of central Tigray and the main territories of Tigray, and moving forward as we see today. So it is a combination of several factors which can explain the success of the TDF insurgency so far. Sadly, the war is not over.
You talked of a strategy, and from your reading on what is happening on the ground and being a peace conflict analyst, what seems to be the end goal, the end game here?
Well, that's a good question. There are several end games, depending on which actor you are having as a vantage point. But from Tigray, as far as I understand it, from both the Tigray government of today, they have articulated an interest to negotiate an outcome of this war, that they want negotiations to happen. And that has been the standpoint from day one. The government of Ethiopia and Abiy Ahmed has rejected any kind of initiative for negotiations from day one until today. But we have seen a change possibly on the TDF side, that early on they called for negotiations immediately after the offensive started in November last year. But then, as the war evolved and as the TDF came on the offensive again early this year, they also put up certain preconditions before negotiations could take place. And these preconditions have been revised in relation to the successes on the battlefield, so to say. So the current set of preconditions for negotiations, as seen from TDF, is likely never to be accepted by Addis Ababa. So it is a stalemate there, that in practice both sides are turning away from negotiations and see the need to settle this by military means. That can change, obviously, when the terrain changes, in the sense of who have the upper hand. But as far as I understand, speaking with the TDF leadership, with Debretsion, with Getachew frequently, the aim of the current offensives going into Afar and Amhara regions have possibly a threefold objective. Of course, first of all, as they say, is to undermine the capacity of the federal government to launch any kind of new attack on Tigray, meaning to destroy the military capacity of the regime in Addis. So you are in kind of hot pursuit, as it is called, of the federal forces, of the regional special forces. The second objective would possibly be to create what is called a strategic depth surrounding Tigray, that when, and I say when, not if, when a new counter-offensive is launched by the federal authorities against Tigrayan forces, that offensive will be fought on Amhara soil and Afar soil, not on Tigrayan soil. That you have a buffer zone to protect the home region, which is a rational military objective in any kind of war of this type. And the third objective is possibly then, or is, as articulated by the leadership, to put pressure on Addis Ababa to accept a negotiation process. Let me not forget, obviously, a key objective here is also to try to create humanitarian access to Tigray, to feed the starving population of Tigray. That is also part of that, but that's a humanitarian objective, not the kind of the military or political objective. So hopefully, as if the offensives are successful, the political military pressure on Addis Ababa will increase by the day for them to accept some kind of negotiation process leading to some kind of transitional arrangement. If the offensives are not successful, obviously Addis doesn't see any need to negotiate.
Yeah, we'll come to that in a moment, but on the diplomatic sphere, the Tigrayan cause seems to have garnered huge support from the international community. Well, support, a very qualified one, I think, politically. How do you account this? To what do you attribute this?
Well, I think yes, it is a qualified support. I agree with you, and it took a long time before the international community woke up to the reality on the ground. The war is not only fought on the battlefields. The war is certainly fought in the social media, in propaganda, in the news media in general, and it has hardly been seen, I would say, the massive propaganda machinery Ethiopia is pouring out when it comes to statements and interpretations and disinformation being peddled, and directly falsehood and lies to the international community. To start with, the international community, and since the communication blockout to Tigray, there has been relatively little information coming out directly from Tigray or from TDF, TPLF, or the Tigray government. So it was kind of a very asymmetrical media war happening at the beginning, and which made the international community a bit hesitant. And in general, diplomats believe in other diplomats, you can say, and they were relating to the official information coming out from Addis. But when more and more data and information were emanating relating to the atrocities taking place in Tigray, the massacres of civilians, the massive rape of women and girls, and so on, it started to change the perceptions among the international, that they became aware that this is, this is not a fair war. This is an atrocity war, and we need to be much more skeptical and much more critical to the Ethiopian government. Also, the involvement of Eritrea tilted that international community in that regard. And I think as the situation has evolved, that position has been strengthened. And I think now the absolute majority of international observers, of diplomats, of reporters, of researchers see through the massive lies and propaganda emanating from Addis Ababa, that you cannot take anything on face value. And that is also shown and proven by the fact that Abiy Ahmed himself have more or less closed down his whole foreign service, decimating the diplomatic representation of Ethiopia abroad, closing consulates and embassies, calling back the absolute majority of diplomats, and chastising them, criticizing the foreign service for failing and convincing the international community that he is right and the Ethiopian government has the right story. It is very difficult for a diplomat to sell lies over and over and over again. You can sell it one time or two times, but when you repeat the lies for weeks and months, they lose credibility. And that happened with the Ethiopian diplomatic service. And that, from my point of view, is a tragedy, because the Ethiopian diplomatic service have been a professional bureaucracy supporting the state throughout different regimes, not necessarily supporting the head of the state, so to say. They have been rather professionalized throughout the Emperor, the Derg, and the EPRDF time. certainly, yes, politicized to a degree, but not to the extent we see today, where the MFA is more or less solely run by some cadres, and the professional diplomats are hiding in shame in their offices because they see that the service they have been, the ministry they have been serving for decades has been the laughingstock of the international community, more or less. Yeah. So that, I think that's very sad to observe, actually. But that also helped, you know, that Ethiopia is pulling back from the international arena, and as the war is dragging on, and also then that the government in Addis Ababa is turning more and more hostile towards the Western powers, particularly US, but also EU and bilateral countries, and the constant externalizing blame for the conflicts in Ethiopia to Western powers trying to undermine stability and so on. It's of course a totally wrong presentation of the reality, but it is also an indication that, you know, Ethiopia is closing in and possibly orienting itself towards Eastern powers. You know, Abiy just been to Turkey and signing deals with the dictator incoming Erdogan there, and getting weapon supplies from Iran and so on, is also a clear indication that Ethiopia's foreign policy is shifting. And this again doesn't help Ethiopia in communicating their case to the international audience.
Yeah, and looking from the other side, I mean, from the international powers, how do you think they have been playing their cards around this Tigray conflict, and how has it, you know, impacted on the on the extent of the war and the harshness of the atrocities that is?
Well, it's two ways to view this or to analyze this. One is, you know, if I may take that first, the more distant, aloof, diplomatic perception of it, where the most you can do is to issue a statement of concern. And that's what we see, you know, from foreign ministries across Europe and America is repeatedly, we are very concerned, we are disturbed, we are concerned about this, concerned about that. And that is the diplomatic language, so to say. That's the standard etiquette on how international relations are communicated. And you have to interpret if they say only we are worried, or if they say disturbed or very concerned, the kind of different levels of interest and engagement. And generally, all this statement doesn't help anything about the situation on the ground in Tigray. It doesn't help anything, as we've seen. Yeah. So you can say there is an engagement, but it's still within the confines of ordinary diplomatic protocol. It hasn't reached the level needed to actually have an impact on the ground, because then we are talking different kind of sanctions, interventions, actions to improve, particularly I'm talking here, the humanitarian access to save lives on the ground. Some actors are more critical than others, obviously. The foremost critic now is the US administration, and they have imposed certain sanctions on some of the perpetrators of the crimes in Tigray. And I know they are discussing different means and ways now how to up those sanctions, possibly. There is also rumored that the State Department in DC are analyzing evidence and discussing if they should categorize what has happened, what is happening as a genocide, if that is decided, I think we will see a very different approach from Washington towards the Tigrayan case, because that, if it is a genocide classification, it enables a lot of more drastic actions and strategies to be taken. But I can certainly understand that the Tigrayan people feel deserted, feel isolated, feel not listened to, because they see that nothing is changing on the ground. That we are complaining that no humanitarian access has been given, and that we have said for 8 months now. And we don't do anything with it, so to say. We don't force or create or enable that room necessarily. But it is the fact, as viewed from the outside, Ethiopia is a sovereign state. This conflict is categorized as a non-international conflict, which put restrictions on what other states can do, and also put restrictions on what UN and UN Security Council can do in terms of the formalities of international law and international relations. That, yeah, it is disappointing, but that's the reality as seen from the diplomatic viewpoint, you can say. And I think many countries are very, hesitating to engage because, first of all, they don't really understand the context. They don't understand the war. They don't have the basic political, historical, ideological, ethnographic knowledge of the area. And secondly, we're talking about Ethiopia, one of the most prominent countries in Africa, the seat of the AU, and the current head of government is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. It is, there are many factors which makes then diplomats a bit hesitant to be confrontational towards Ethiopia, because Ethiopia carries some weight in this regard.
You said that there are discussions now going on as to whether to characterize what's happening in Tigray a genocide or not. Let me ask you your take on that. What, in light of what happened, sexual violence of huge proportions, that was the subject of the Amnesty International recent report, using it as a weapon of war, also famine as a weapon of war, and this widespread massacres, ethnic cleansing, forced displacement, mass abduction and arrest, and also, enforced disappearances, that was the subject of the Human Rights Watch report yesterday, and blanket denial of services targeting whole populations. What is left for one to see that this is a genocide or not?
Yeah, it is no doubt that there have been massive war crimes and crimes against humanity, as it is classified, in Tigray during this war. No doubt about that. But genocide is by definition something else. And it doesn't necessarily relate to the numbers of people killed or the numbers of people raped. It relates to the fact that, are you killed or raped because you are a Tigrayan? Because of your ethnic identity in this case. So if we can get documentation on the intent that I'm doing this to you, not because you stand in the way or because I want to, conquer this area, but because you are who you are, then one can underpin an argument that this is a genocidal war. And I believe I am doing research on this, and also together with Tigrayan colleagues, so to say. And I believe we can find evidence that it is a genocidal intent from a military political leadership who have converted this down to actual actions on the ground, both obviously from the Eritrean side, but also from the Ethiopian side and the actions of the ENDF and Amhara forces. I know that there are several researchers and others working on this to try to document it more properly. And again, it is ongoing as we speak, because the ethnic profiling and arrests, harassments, detentions happening in Addis Ababa and elsewhere in Ethiopia today towards Tigrayans who are not part of the war. Clearly, they are not in the war theater, but are only taken out because they are Tigrayans. That's also a clear indication that there is an intent to take out people because of their identity. So from my scholarly perspective, yes, I am considering this within a genocidal framework. However, it is not the scholars or professors or researchers who are the judges of genocide or not. It has to be proven in court. It has to be an international juridical process, or a national, reaching such a verdict, so to say, because genocide is a juridical classification reached through a court process, most likely. So it is one thing to write academically about it. It's different to prove it in the court process.
So once this discussion is exhausted and that this situation is termed as genocide, what happens next?
Well, it is one thing if a country like the US now, if it is any truth into that information that they are looking into that, if a country decides that we think it is genocide going on, then it obligates it to try to its utmost to stop what is happening, possibly also through interventions. That's international law. But if it is a change of regime in Ethiopia and the incoming government also says it was a genocide happening, the new government can of course establish juridical processes to take that to court, either a national domestic jurisdiction or an international jurisdiction. The Ethiopian case can be handled internationally now through the International Criminal Court in The Hague, but since Ethiopia is not a signatory to the Rome Statutes, which is the framework of the International Criminal Court, the ICC doesn't have legal mandate to prosecute or to investigate and prosecute perpetrators today without the UN Security Council making a so-called referral case. If the UN Security Council decides that we think what is happening in Ethiopia, in Tigray, is a genocidal war, and we would like ICC to start investigation and possibly prosecution, that might happen. But as the UN Security Council is acting today, that is no hope, because they will never agree on that. Because of both the big power, the veto powers are disagreeing. China and Russia will not accept that. But also, the 3 African members of the Security Council today hasn't shown an interest to address the Tigrayan war at the level needed. And as is usual practice, since this is an African case, the Security Council will listen to the advice offered by the African member states in the Security Council.
And not all the territories, parts of Tigray are liberated. There are still forces, Eritrean and Amhara militias Eritrean forces and Amhara militias, particularly in the western part of Tigray. And that was in spite of all the repeated calls for Eritrea to withdraw its forces. And now there are reports of Eritrean reinforcements again, which you also tweeted just a few days back. So how do you explain this? Could the inaction of the international community, in spite of its resolutions at different levels, could that have emboldened the Eritrean government to send more troops?
Yes, to a certain degree, I could believe in the plausibility of such of that argument. What we do see, Eritrean troops, Eritrea involved itself from day one in the war against Tigray in November last year, but still, and has been active throughout, and still are, as you say, deployed in Tigray, West Tigray, and in some of the northern territories along the border. But still, this conflict is not categorized as an international conflict, basically because Eritrean forces and Eritrea were invited by Addis Ababa, by the Ethiopian government, by the recognized sovereign government, to take part in the war. So it is not a hostile force against Ethiopia. So
but it's hostile against the population.
Yes, it is hostile against the population on invitation and consent by your own government. Your own government. So that makes international law, mute on that issue, that, it is not an internationalized conflict, which kind of encourages Eritrea to continue what they're doing, also because they are in cohort with Abiy Ahmed and the federal authorities. So it is a joint strategy we are seeing. It is not, at certain intervals, we have seen that Eritrean forces are operating outside the realm or outside the command structure or outside the strategy of the federal Ethiopian forces. But in general, they are there because also Abiy wants them to be there. So it is that in itself, that it is not classified as an internationalized war, makes the maneuvering room for the UN Security Council, for instance, much less. Much less they can do as long as it is not an internationalized war. So I think what we do see today, that new deployments of Eritrean forces to West Tigray, probably because of Ethiopian forces and Amhara forces have been pulled out of West Tigray in order to fight the TDF offensives in Amhara. And so Eritrea is filling in, so to say, the vacuum left by the departing Ethiopian Amhara forces. But also concerning is the intelligence we do have on Eritrean reinforcements along the border to Tigray, along the Salambesa, Rama, Badme front lines, and the possibility of a new offensive. We should be very attentive to what's happening on the northern front too.
Just recently, you tried to draw parallel between the Taliban takeover of Kabul and the advancing Tigrayan forces. What lessons can be learned, and what differences? Surely there are differences can be seen in these two movements.
Yeah, my tweet was not did not intend to see to compare Taliban with TDF or TDF with Taliban. Not at all. I said that we need more understanding on how insurgencies operate when they can be so successful without the international community being aware of it. The rapid advancement of Taliban in Afghanistan, which so-called came as a surprise to everyone. I don't think it was a surprise, but every politician and military leader and NATO and everyone say that, oh, this is such a big surprise. I don't believe it. It's just an excuse. Obviously, they should have had intelligence on this, and they should have had better empirical grounded research to start with in order to get the forewarning of this. And that's the kind of a similarity to Ethiopia, the rapid advances and success of the Operation Alula, for instance, and the current advances in the offensives in Ethiopia today need also to be explained more properly, need to be understood better. And of course, here we again come into understanding the local context, the local political situation, the ethnography of the terrain, so to say, that what is the connection between the people and the political front, the insurgency leadership, how how embedded, how connected is the leadership to the grassroots, because such offensives, and how is, not least, how is the adversary, how is the state perceived, how well is the formal government, the Afghanistan government and the Ethiopian government, how well is it democratically anchored in their countries? Do they reflect the people's interest, the majority's interest? Are they accountable politically, economically? Are they performing well in governance? Are they non-corrupt? Are they role models, morally, politically, economically? All this is factored in. And certainly in Afghanistan, where you have one of the most corrupt regimes ever, stealing money from the local people, stealing money from their own army, so to say, who are sent out to fight Taliban without bullets or guns because the leaders have put the money in their own pockets. Who would like to do the fighting for a corrupt political leadership? They rather run away, and hence explaining the rapid successes of the Taliban, because the so-called 300,000 troops Afghan army just withered from one day to the other. But that explains part of it, but it lacks the explanation that Taliban obviously delivers something to some local communities in order to get the support they have gotten throughout this war and also the offensive, that there is some kind of report that they managed to provide something which the government in Kabul didn't manage to provide. And I think that's possibly the best similarity with the Ethiopian case, that TDF is providing something to the people, both security protection, but also something else, some emotional connection, some political substance of visions, and belongingness, and a lot of other attributes to this, which helps explain that the broad-based people's support for the insurgency or for the TDF defense forces. And again, that shouldn't come as a surprise to us. I mean, if you know it, if you know the context, if you know the people, if you know the history, it is rather easy to connect the dots to say that the Tigrayan war, the TDF offensives would in the end be successful. That's has been my opinion all the way. Not because it has a political position, but because of all the empirical evidence underpinning that conclusion.
The recent agreement that was the TDF and the Oromo Liberation Front announced, what do you think will have any Do you think it will have any implication on the balance of forces and also on the future political dispensation in Ethiopia?
Yeah, I think so far, just, a week or so after that announcement, and I believe, they have been talking for some while, but it is now publicly announced from both sides that they have an alliance, and not even a tactical alliance, but a strategic alliance, as I understand it. And I think, first of all, this is a political, symbolic victory of great importance, which not yet necessarily have converted down to some military significance. That might come later. But the importance is the political, what it communicates politically. And here it is, to be very blunt, TPLF, not TDF, but TPLF hasn't been the most popular guys around in Oromia for the last 27 years or so. And certainly not among the OLF segments of the people. So for OLA to accept and to enter into and to sign a strategic alliance with TPLF, remembering the treatment of OLF in 1992 and onwards, that is a huge gap which have been crossed in terms of trust and confidence building between then the Oromo insurgencies and Tigray, TPLF. And I think that's a symbolic thing, that it signals that, okay, we are leaving the history behind. We are leaving 27 years of grievances against you because you arrested us, you killed us, we were fighting you too. But now we see that the common enemy and the danger of Ethiopia as such, so to say, and the livelihoods of the Oromos and the Tigaros, we need to come together again. And that politically is extremely significant, which might again then have a ripple effect. So other ethnic resistant movements in Ethiopia will also feel comfortable to join that kind of alliance. So that's what I said in an earlier tweet, that are we seeing the emergence of EPRDF's second version? Not in the sense that it will be the same ideological platform or the same structures as EPRDF, but in the sense of a multinational federalist resistant movement. Because this is not, as of today, not a political civilian struggle, it is a military struggle, has converted into. And hopefully, dearly, I hope that the TPLF leadership has learned from all their mistakes they did in the early 1990s with their partner front, so to say, and with other groupings in the country, and that it will be a different collaborative, equal relationship between these groupings this time around.
And finally, many agree that huge dent has been, created because of what happened. The social fabric, a huge attempt was done to, weaken the social fabric. And my question is, can Ethiopia be saved from fragmentation? And what needs to happen to avert that?
Yeah. I believe that it will be impossible for Ethiopia to return back to what it was prior to the outbreak of the war. That kind of, okay, we get a transitional process, but we basically more or less operate as we used to do, so to say, under the same constitutional framework. I have very hard to see that happening now. Can Ethiopia be saved from disintegration? Well, you know, it depends on how you look upon disintegration. Is Ethiopia disintegrating if Tigray leaves and become a sovereign entity? Ethiopia will still exist, but Ethiopia without Tigray. Will Ethiopia manage to exist if the Somali regional state exits? Possibly. Will Ethiopia manage to exist if Oromia regional state want to succeed? No, because then there's no territory left, so to say. So the geographical peripheral or fringe states can leave, and you still have an Ethiopia, but Oromia can't, in my view, because then there's nothing left as such of consolidated territory. But you can imagine other kind of reconfigurations of an entity called Ethiopia. If we go to that direction, that you will have a transitional arrangement. And one such model can be a confederate Ethiopia, where you still have an entity called Ethiopia, but under that entity you have sovereign states. The sovereign state of Tigray, which have direct, you know, which have full sovereignty and international relations and diplomatic representations, and of Afar and Oromia and so on and so forth. But together they come together under, you know, an EU model, to use that term, that they give away some sovereignty to a transnational body, an Ethiopian government, which just represents on certain defense maybe, or certain foreign relation issues, currency, fiscal policies to a certain degree. So that can be imagined, which can satisfy the needs of particularly the Tegaru of not trusting the center any longer, not trusting Ethiopia, not trusting the other Ethiopian people to protect them or to trust them. And it can satisfy the needs possibly of OLA if they continue along a kind of a successionist agenda policy. But there is a lot of issues to be hammered out also under such an arrangement, which might be very, very difficult to agree upon. And certainly what the Amhara community or the Amhara political elite want to do will be significant on the future of Ethiopia. They are the second biggest group. They are the core territory. They have enormous resources to project into such a process. So I don't know what will happen with Ethiopia. I think it will be very tough in the time to come. I'm not optimistic, to use that term.
Okay, thank you very much for all your reflections and your insights. And with this, we come to the end of the interview.
Thank you.